Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 57 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll learn about transactions in SQL Server. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch part 56 of this video series. So what's a transaction? A transaction is a group of commands that change the data stored in a database. A transaction is treated as a single unit. A transaction ensures that either all of the commands succeed or none of them. If one of the commands in the transaction fails, all of the commands fail, and any data that was modified in the database is then rolled back. In this way, transactions maintain the integrity of data in a database. Let's look at an example. I have this table TBL product which has got information about laptops and desktops. At the moment, the quantity of laptops available is 100. Now let's say I want to change the quantity to 200, and to do that, we are issuing this update statement, update TBL product set quantity available is equal to 200, where product ID is equal to 1. Now when I execute the statement, you can see that one row affected. Now when we select the data back, you should see the quantity available is 200. Now this update statement is not part of any transaction. So as soon as you execute this update statement, the change is made permanent to the database immediately. On the other hand, you can make this update statement belong to a transaction by including begin transaction. So now let's try to change the quantity to 300. So now this update statement is part of the transaction. When we execute these two statements together, look at this, it says one row affected. Now from within the same window, within the same connection, when I select the data back from the table, look at this, it shows 300. But then let's try to make another connection to this SQL Server. So this is a different connection. Now when I try to select the data from the same table, look at what's going to happen. It says executing query, and then if you look at the product table, it has got only two rows. To select that rows from that table, it should take less than a second. But if you look at this, it's almost more than 10 seconds now. It is still executing. That's because you have initiated this transaction, but you did not either commit this or roll this back, because of which other users will not be able to see that uncommitted data by default. And that's because SQL Server's default isolation level is read committed, meaning read only committed data. But here if you look at this, there is some uncommitted data in this TBL product table. That's why I'm not able to see the data from that table. So let's cancel that, and if I want to see the data, what I can do is basically set the transaction isolation level to read uncommitted data. Okay, so let's do that. Set transaction isolation level to read uncommitted. So let's execute this. Command completed. Now if I execute the select star from TBL product, I am able to see the read uncommitted data. Now when I roll this transaction back, execute this, command completed successfully. Now look at this, when I execute select star from TBL product, before we execute select star from TBL product, this is the previous data, this is that uncommitted 300. Now when I execute this query, look at this, the change is undone. So now whenever your update, insert, delete statements, whenever these are part of a transaction, now the change is not made immediately permanent to the database until you commit that transaction. So if you want to make the change permanent, you commit the transaction. If you want to undo the change, then you roll back the transaction. So for example, let's say at the minute, the quantity available for laptops is 200. Let's try to change it to 300 as part of this transaction. And then to make that change permanent, I basically have to say commit transaction. At this point, the change is made permanent to the database. Now, transaction processing follows very simple steps. You begin a transaction using begin transaction, and then you process the database commands. You might have one or more SQL Server commands, inserts, updates, and deletes, and then you check for any errors. If there are errors, you roll the transaction back. Otherwise, you commit the transaction. Let's look at an example. I have two tables here, TBL physical address and TBL mailing address. Now, in reality, let's say we are shopping online. Most of the e-commerce sites have mailing address and billing address, and most of us will have the same mailing and billing address. Along the same lines here, if you look at this, we have a physical and a mailing address. And if you look at this employee 101, he has the same mailing and physical address. Now if you look at the London, the city spelling, London is misspelled here. And obviously I want to correct this. To correct this, I have a stored procedure here. And if you look at the stored procedure, it's a pretty simple one. All we are doing here is we are updating mailing address table and physical address table. And we are setting the city to the correct spelling. Okay, and if you look at these two update statements, these are wrapped between begin transaction and commit transaction blocks, and this block is further wrapped between begin try and end try. And then following the try block is the catch block, where we are rolling the transaction back. We have spoken about handling errors using try catch blocks in the previous session of this video series. If you are new to error handling, please check that video first. Okay, so obviously when we execute the stored procedure, what's going to happen? It's going to execute the first update statement, and then it's going to execute the second update statement. And if there are no errors, the transaction will be committed. If there are errors whenever you are executing this first or second update statement, what's going to happen? The control will immediately be transferred to the catch block, and within the catch block we are rolling the transaction back. Okay, now since these are two simple update statements, we both of these statements should succeed and correct the city spelling to London. Let's look at this. So I have these two tables, physical address and mailing address. So if you look at this, at the minute the city spelling is incorrect, and we have the same stored procedure that we have seen on the slide, which updates the mailing address and the physical address tables. And then in addition, we also have print transaction committed, just to print a message, to prove that it committed the transaction. So let's create this stored procedure now. And now before we execute, let's quickly check the data in TBL physical address and mailing address. The spelling is incorrect. So let's execute the stored procedure. So one row affected, one row affected. So the first one row affected is when we updated the mailing address. The second one is when we updated the physical address, and then we have that transaction committed message printed by this print statement, which means the transaction has been committed. So now when we check the physical and mailing address, you should see the spelling is now corrected. Now let's try to introduce an error intentionally. Now if you look at the second update, it's the same stored procedure, except that the second update statement has got, here we are setting the city to London, London. Okay, basically what we are trying to do here is, if you look at the column length, the city column length in TBL physical address table. So if you look at the city column length, it's 10 characters. But now I'm trying to update the physical address to London, London. And London space London is definitely more than 10 characters. So obviously when this update statement is being executed, we will get an error. Now let's change the mailing address to London 1. Now when we change this stored procedure, let's change this. So alter procedure. Now when we execute the stored procedure, what's going to happen? It comes here, it updates the mailing address, okay, to London 1, which is fine. And then when it comes to updating the physical address, what's going to happen? Okay, the city column length is 10, but the value is more than 10, so this is going to throw an exception. So when an exception occurs, what's going to happen? The control immediately goes to the catch block, and catch block is rolling back the transaction. So when we roll the transaction back, what's going to happen? Whatever change that was made by this first update statement is also going to be undone. So this update statement changed it to London 1, but then it will be rolled back, so it will remain London. And then it will finally print transaction rolled back. So let's see that in action. Let's execute this. You see that one row affected, then it says zero rows affected. So it first updated city to London 1, and then when it was trying to do this, we got that 0 rows affected. So because there was an error when we were trying to execute this, immediately the control will go to the catch block, roll back transaction, and you should see print, transaction rolled back. As a result of which, if you now select the data from these two tables, you should see as if we didn't update anything because the transaction is rolled back. So both of these statements are treated as a single unit, because a transaction ensures either both of them succeed or none of them. And in this way, transactions maintain the integrity of the database. Now, we discussed that a transaction is a group of database commands. Now, what database commands are part of a transaction is determined by an ACID test, meaning the commands that belong in a transaction have to be atomic, consistent, isolated, and durable. What we mean by this ACID test we will look at in the next video session. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.